Once he started talking about 2014 and on, I thought he had some interesting arguments. We have to understand this is a former intelligence officer.
Yeah.
He knows the game of propaganda. He knows how to look good. He knows how to deliver his message.
Our good friend Mike Koeniger, the brick wall friend of the show, is going to be on the show at 14 past. Let's talk about that Tucker Carlson interview. Liked it, loved it, hated it, not sure. I don't know, but let's find out.
By the way, my name is Joe McClain. I host a radio program called A Catholic Take, where we look at the world through a Catholic lens. I'd love for you to hang out with us. If you like it, give it a thumbs up and let us know what you think in the comments below.
Mike Koeniger, friend of the show, brick wall over in Virginia. Good morning to you, Mike. What'd you think? Tucker Carlson, Vladimir Putin? What was your opinion?
I think it was quite interesting. I know those former history students of the year, like you and myself, both probably enjoyed the first 30-minute history lesson he gave us, which, you know, I had watched Tucker's little preview, and he said he goes on and on, but I guess he had a point. I didn't find that his history from 865 to 1930 was terribly compelling, by the way. All land is conquered land. All land belonged to somebody else before. I thought that whole argument was specious, but once he started talking about 2014 and on and 1989 and on, I thought he had some interesting arguments. But Joe, before I even comment much more, we have to understand this is a former intelligence officer. He knows the game of propaganda. He knows how to look good. He's very polished. He's obviously incredibly bright. And so he knows how to deliver his message.
I loved it from that perspective. For me, that was the entertainment part, right? Like Vladimir Putin is no dummy. He's been around the block for a long time. And of course, you know, he's a heavy hitter when it comes to like propaganda and of course, you know, manipulation and speech. And to your point, I agree. I mean, everything, the entire history of humanity is a history and of moving borders, of immigration. That's true for all of humanity. There's no exception to the rule. He did ask some very interesting questions. Nonetheless, we finally got to some of them, like who bombed the pipeline. I thought that was an interesting moment, didn't you?
Oh, I was fascinated by that, and quite frankly, the only side that had anything to gain in that was Ukraine to bomb that pipeline. So there's certainly something going there. I think his point regarding the coup in Ukraine in 2014. I think that's kind of common knowledge amongst those news junkies around that the CIA likely had a hand in it, just like they did in the 28-day Mordad coup in Iran in 57. So, you know, I don't think those are big shockers. You know, we know the CIA plays games and is certainly usually in the American interest to do so. So I thought that interesting. You know, the bottom line, Joe, is if Colonel Dooley's estimates are correct, Russia's lost 300,000 people fighting this war, and I'm still not sure what the gain is other than the Donbass region.
Following Vladimir Putin's argumentation, he's saying, listen, Ukraine is historically a part of Russia, so it needs to continue to be historically part of Russia. We talked about that a minute ago. Well, that's kind of, you know, like you say, a specious argument. I mean, that's the same argument that Palestinians use to say that Israel doesn't belong to the Jews, for instance. Or you could argue that Texas doesn't belong to America, should belong to Mexico, for instance. You can make that argument. So there's that. But then on the other side of that is, okay, well, at the end of the day, there is a contentious divide between the West and the East. Clearly, he's aligned with China. He talked a lot about his economic relations and his strategic relations with China. He talked a lot about the bitterness he had in the Clinton years to try to find a way to work with the West. You know, and again, a lot of manipulation in his tone, a lot of manipulation in his approach in that part of the conversation. But nonetheless, he sort of is laying the argument here that, hey, what do you want me to do? NATO kept coming up to my border. They didn't think, you know, Russia's no big deal. You know, he was very casually just laying all of these little talking points to say, you should be very, very concerned.
I took it the same way. And the one compelling argument he had in my mind was the expansion of NATO. And this is something that, you know, candidate Trump in 2016 talked about is what is the purpose of NATO today? And when I was a kid, the purpose of NATO was to oppose the Warsaw Pact and stop the spread of communism through Europe, which it effectively did once they ceded half of Europe, by the way, to Stalin, but we won't go down that path. But, that I thought was his compelling argument. When Poland became a part of NATO, if I'm the Russian president, that sets off alarm bells in my head. What is the United States and the NATO? What are the NATO powers up to? Why are they all around me? Why are they taking former Soviet satellite states into their orbit? And what is the end game here? And and I don't like Vladimir Putin. I don't think any Western mind can see that he's a good guy. That part of his argument was quite compelling to me.
Tucker gave him ample opportunity, I would argue. Repeatedly tried to bait Putin into it, I would even suggest, to get Putin to come out and say, the Americans are running this puppet nation led by Zelensky. The Americans are really in charge here. The Americans have did the coup on the border. Tucker tried several times to get him to weigh in on that. Putin avoided those pitfalls. It seemed like every time he wouldn't take the bait, he wouldn't come out and say it. Tucker kept following up with that. Well, don't you think Zelensky is just doing what he's told by the Biden administration? Why don't you just negotiate directly with the Biden administration? Putin kept coming back and saying, listen, he's the elected official, Zelensky. He could do, he's in charge. He could negotiate if he wants to. What do you think about that? It seemed interesting that Putin wouldn't take the bait.
I think it's all a political game. And again, this guy is well polished. He's well trained. He's 72 years old, 71, 72 years old. He's been in this game a long time. And he is really looking for a negotiated settlement to stop the attrition of Russian soldiers right now. And he wants to keep the Donbass region in the Russian orbit. And then he can do whatever he wants in Ukraine because he has an inroad there. I really think that's what he's looking for. If we believe what he said about the Istanbul peace accords, he was ready to sign a deal, Joe. And
that was interesting too.
If he's telling the truth, and I don't believe he's not, because I had heard that there were peace accords and that the West encouraged Ukraine not to sign. I have heard that from other sources other than Vladimir Putin.
That's been reported now for a while. The Prime Minister of England at the time, Johnson, went over there and basically put an end to that peace deal. And so Vladimir Putin really hammered on that point. Let me just bring this up. I felt like whenever issues of faith came up and Tucker sort of gently walked into this, he even sort of asked the question to Putin, do you think demonic forces, I hate my words, not Tucker's, he used different words, but I thought the heart of the question was, do you think demonic forces are at play in the world around us today? Anything on the faith, I felt like Putin was weak sauce. I felt like he really didn't show and express his own Orthodox Russian faith there. He seems to embrace this more ecumenical approach. Didn't you get that sense?
Oh, I'm glad you brought this up, because that was the part of the interview that I was seriously unhappy about, was when Tucker asked him about his Orthodox faith. He started talking about national identity. Basically, I'm an Orthodox because I'm a Russian, and Orthodoxy is the religion of Russia, and it's what contributes to our culture. And I heard that, and I said, for a guy who we've read statements from him that are overtly Orthodox statements of faith that we shared with our forebears when we were one faith, I was shocked that his whole response to his Christian identity was political. And that's what it was, Joe. He was talking about the politics of being Orthodox, and that's what made him Russian, was that he was Orthodox. And he's right about one thing. The Black Sea Germans practiced their Catholic faith in relative autonomy. In modern Russia, they didn't during the Stalin years. And we know that. And I'm sure some of the Muslims that aren't in Chechnya, they get to practice their religion. He talked about that. But I think, it was very, very Western-oriented answer. It didn't talk about his actual faith.
I think the last 15 minutes was really the best part of the whole interview, personally. I mean, the rest of it was just kind of meandering a little bit. But I was proud of Tucker to ask Putin directly for the release of that journalist.
I thought that was Tucker putting the hammer down. If anyone doubts that Tucker Carlson, they may not agree with his politics, but he is a real journalist who went in, and in that last 30 minutes of that interview, he hammered Putin pretty hard in a very respectful way. And from everything I've read, when you interview Putin, you have to tread very lightly, because if you insult him, he just gets up and walks away. So I think Tucker handled it very well. He kept Putin engaged for, 2 hours? 2 hours and a bit.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
he
it's
did a
long.
nice job. I have read pre-reports on this interview, by the way, that said if Tucker Carlson doesn't ask for the release, then we just know he's a Putin shill. Well, Tucker had already asked the question on the 6th because the interview was on the 6th. And
Yeah.
so I kind of chuckled when I watched the interview and said, you guys don't know Carlson. You think he's something he's not. So that was the fun part. I agree.
Without exaggerating, I have literally interviewed thousands of people over the last 20 years of doing media. I would not have performed nearly as well as Tucker did. Vladimir Putin would have made me look utterly ridiculous. I'm not even exaggerating. I really believe that. I believe that I've never sat in front of someone like a Vladimir Putin. Like, could I stand my ground? Like, could I, with as much deference, with as much skill, with as much patience as Tucker Carlson had to have to go through 45 minutes of a history lesson and not upset the apple cart to the point where Vlad gets up and walks off, but to keep him on the conversation to the point where Tucker got to end it, right? It was at the end of it, it was like complete opposite. It was schoolboy in the beginning and then master at the end, because at the end, Tucker was the one who decided when to end this thing. I just wanted to say that although I am slightly critical of Tucker Carlson in this interview, I don't want it to be thought that I didn't recognize, as somebody who's done this, that he's at a level above. Right? He is definitely, I believe he's at a level above, because like if you watch a lot of talking head commentators who are like national, international figures, Stephanopoulos or Cronkite,
the lady Ampur, Christiana Ampur, or whatever
you can
her name
name
is.
anybody you want. Raymond Arroyo. I'd put Raymond Arroyo up there. Guess what? Raymond's got a clipboard with all the questions. Or nowadays, he's got an iPad or an iPhone on his lap looking down. They're all doing it. What did Tucker have in his lap? Just curious.
Nothing.
Tucker was there. He was present. He was listening. He tried to interject in that first hour and a half. Putin schooled him, told him to shut up, sit down, and listen. So he could have gotten feisty, and he probably would have lost it all. He used prudential judgment, kept Putin on the hook, kept him talking, and was able to ask him, and then out of nowhere comes a left jab. Who bombed this? Who bombed the pipeline? You did. I was busy that day. Like, man, baller moment. Just baller moment. An hour and a half of college history lecture to who bombed the pipeline? You did. I was busy that day.
A discussion on the radio is a negotiation, and my professional life, negotiation is a big part of what I do. And you cannot be thinking of the next question while the person is talking. And that is tough not to want to do, particularly if you're someone who has a love of discussion, where as soon as Joe finishes, I'm going to ask him this question. You can't do that. And Tucker doesn't do that. And so for him to come back with, I was busy that day. That was quick.
That was good, man. That was so good. That was so good.
And Putin chuckled. Putin thought that was funny.
As soon as I know, that's what I loved about it. It was like, because Tucker and Putin obviously were able to have a little tit for tat, right? Like this guy's no joke. He was KGB. Mm-hmm. He was, you're not 20 years in power in Russia and not be a gangster, right? Like this guy's mob material. Like the mob is not as good as this guy. So, I'll say this. I had hoped that Tucker would ask some other kinds of questions that he didn't. Of like, for instance, like the Wagner Group boss all of a sudden mysteriously dying in a plane crash.
Yeah.
How do you explain that, Vlad? Explain that one to me, Vlad. What did you think about what Vlad said about Poland and Russian history and all the rest?
I was chuckling because he's playing fast and loose with the facts. Stalin also had an agreement with Hitler and cooperated with Hitler until Hitler turned on him, and he's throwing the Poles under the bus, so to speak. Meanwhile, what is it? The scriptural saying, "Splinter in your eye while you have the log in your own." I was kind of listening to that, saying, "What's going on here, Vladdy?" you're kind of ignoring the fact that Stalin was cooperating with Hitler as well. And yeah, I found that fascinating as well. And you know, I'm not so sure that Russia was going to go fly in and save Czechoslovakia from Hitler when they had a treaty with Hitler at the time. And so I disbelieve that. That was fiction.
Did you get the sense from Vladimir Putin that he has any intentions for further expansion beyond what he considers territorial lands that are historically Russian?
I didn't get that sense. I know that the colonel yesterday would disagree with me, but I think he wants what he believes is historically Russian. Which, think about that. That in and of itself is scary enough. Imagine if you had an Austrian leader who wanted everything that was historically Austria. We're talking half of Europe there, folks. Half of Europe would be Austrian.
I know a guy from Austria, happens to go by Habsburg. I am trying to encourage him to get the band back together, but
he's a good young man too, isn't he?
He is, yeah.
So he's and his book is really great. If you haven't read it, folks, please check it out. The Habsburg Way, isn't that what it's called? The Habsburg Way.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I met him
check
when I was in Rome. I got to hang out with him for a few minutes. It was great.
Yeah, I mean, but my point being, if you use those historical precedences like Putin does, you can take all kinds of land away and never be outside your historical Russian grounds or your historical Austrian grounds. And so does that then thereby give the Austrians the power to invade France?
Now, I haven't seen it yet, but what it strikes me, because I've already seen memes going around about like, I'm going to tell you about how the Civil War started, and Tucker's like, oh, so like Missouri Compromise and stuff, and Putin goes, it's in the someone shared, I think Rudy shared it in the insider group, and Putin responds, no, we have to start with when the Anglo-Saxons arrived, and like he goes back all the way. That is how the old world thinks, and that's especially how the East thinks. Yes. And us Westerners, and especially us Americans, cannot comprehend it because we're teenagers on the world stage. Like for us, trad means the 1950s, like, and conservative means like the liberals of the 1700s and 1800s. Yeah. That's our worldview is a couple hundred years old, and that's all we can conceive of. And when you're dealing with the old world and especially the East, you have to really like forget your way of thinking about things. And it's like, to go back, like, this all goes back to these things got bad under Obama, or these things got bad under Clinton, or these things got bad under maybe Jimmy Carter or whatever. Like, no, like these things go back a long time. And to get to causes, like things weren't like fine and dandy, like because we had some periods of economic success in America when under supposedly like conservative, like old-fashioned American ideals. Like, we think that that's the good old days that we have to get back to, So, and things got bad once, insert thing from the 20th century came around.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's not how that works. And that's where maybe that I would love if that kind of, you have to go back that far to understand where this is coming from. Like, I would love if more people
You start pulling on that thread, though, Jake, you're going to end up in Genesis chapter 3.
Of course, but like that's where you have to go back to. You have to go back.
I'm going to share something, though, that someone told me once. I was having a discussion with a Maronite Arab at a restaurant. And he and I started talking politics a little bit to a degree. And, of course, Maronites are Catholics, by the way.
Yes.
They're our Eastern Catholic brothers.
It's funny you bring it up. It's his feast day today, St. John Maron.
There you go. So, and this guy and I are talking about Middle Eastern policy, which is an obsession for me, and we're talking about the plight of Christians in Israel. And this would have been 4 or 5 years ago. And he said, the serious issue I see is that we in the Middle East think in millennia. We have a millennial perspective to everything that goes on, which is what you saw in Putin last night, by the way. And you Americans, and when he said it, I went, he's so right. You think in election cycles. You think in election cycles.
Did you like that video? It's okay. You can admit it. It's perfectly fine. Hey, we cover the big stories of our day, from inside the church to outside the church to all points in between, and we do it from a Catholic perspective. It's called A Catholic Take. It's a radio program Monday through Friday. We live stream it right here on this channel, by the way, so make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We would be very grateful to you. And don't forget, you're going to want to watch this video right here because you don't want to miss anything.